Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 315. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about locks and aqueducts and narrowboats as we go cruising on the canals of England.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have two news stories for you. The first one is a serious story that's going to put some pressure on Egypt's already hurting tourism business, and that was two American women were kidnapped in Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula. They were released very quickly by the Egyptian military, but that is not a good sign in a country that's been having some problems getting to democracy and also having some problems with the United States. That does not bode well for Egyptian tourism going forward. And then in another story, possibly more controversial, an ex-Qantas economist says obese flyers should pay more. Tony Weber, now managing director of Weber Quantitative Consulting and associate professor of University of Sydney Business School, claims that fuel burnt by planes depends on many things, but the most important is the weight of the aircraft. The more a plane weighs, the more fuel it burns. And so it only follows that if you weigh more, you should pay more. So are you ready to either pay more for your flight or get back to the gym? Leave a comment on this episode and let me know. You can find a link to both of these stories at the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Richard Graw, who's coming to us from Niskayuna, New York, and come to talk to us about an interesting way of seeing England. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's great to be here.
Now, you have done something that I have always wanted to, can't talk my wife into so far, and most people probably even haven't heard of, and that is canal cruising in England.
It is a very English pastime, I would say. And yeah, it's a wonderful way to see England.
And when we say canal cruising, we're not talking about the Panama Canal and great big ships.
No, you're absolutely right. Just kind of as a little bit of a background, the English canal system was built probably between, say, 1780 and 1900, during the height of England's Industrial Revolution, they realized that in spite of their good road system, it was easier to move large amounts of raw materials to factories by water as opposed to by road. So first of all, they used the English rivers, and then they realized, well, the rivers don't always go where you want to go, so they built these canals. And they're probably, by and large, most of them 20 or 40 feet wide.
At the widest spots.
At the widest, and about 3 feet deep at the deepest.
And they go all over England. In fact, a lot of them predate the railroads. In fact, the railroads are what eventually caused a lot of the canals to get filled in.
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct.
But the odd thing is, even though we're further away from the Industrial Revolution, there are more canals now, you were telling me, in use than there were 20 years ago.
Yes, probably right after World War II, the English had filled in a number of canals in the 20s and 30s because they were no longer a viable means of transportation with trucks and trains. And so after World War II, there became sort of a movement to start to use the canals again. And then that really kind of picked up in the 60s and 70s. And now the canals are under the auspices of an organization called British Waterways, which is a nonprofit organization. And they have started to dig out canals that had been filled in because they are becoming so popular for vacations and to walk and for recreational purposes.
Now, you have done this not once, not twice, but 3 times?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay. And what different routes have you taken? What canals have you been on?
The first time we went from Stratford-upon-Avon towards Warwick on what's called the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal. And the second time we went on the Llangollen Canal, which runs west to east from Llangollen, which is farther north, to a small town called Marple. And then the third time we started once again just outside of Stratford-upon-Avon in a small town called Wootton Waven. Actually, the best part of England is just the names of the towns. Starting from Wootton Waven, going up to Kingswood Junction, where the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal intersects with the Grand Union Canal, and then traveling on the Grand Union Canal to Warwick. And then we reversed that, coming back along the Grand Union and then down the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal to Wootton Waven.
Excellent. Now, before we get too far into it, and I would like to go through some of your itineraries in more detail, but before we get too far into it, can you give us an idea of what the experience of canal boating or narrowboat cruising is like?
Well, like I said, it's a very English experience. There are canals in France, not as extensive as there are in England, and obviously there are canals in Holland, not as extensive as in England. But it's a very English experience. It is floating 3 miles an hour through the English countryside, which is some of the most beautiful countryside in the world. You're out of the hustle and bustle of London, even though there are canals that do go through London and Manchester and Liverpool and the major cities in England. But it's a chance to just kind of turn off the cell phone, step back into a simpler time, and meet people who you would never sit down and chat with in a normal sort of everyday, got to go to the Starbucks, got to get to work, got to go to the grocery store, got to go home, got to feed the kids kind of thing.
Okay. And when you talk about 3 miles an hour, you also have to stop periodically because there are more than a few locks.
Yes. Part of the challenge with the Panama Canal, there's changes in altitude and elevation. Obviously, the water doesn't run uphill, so the engineers had devised methods to move the boats up the hill and down the hill. So there are locks, there are tunnels, there are bridges.
And the bridges are definitely the most bizarre thing. I don't know if people can picture this, but the boat going over a bridge.
Yes, and actually there's a very famous aqueduct that was on the Llangollen Canal, which I can't pronounce it, Pontcysy.
So it's a Welsh name.
Absolutely. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was built in the late 18th century and is 200 feet in the air. You are in a trough that is 7 feet wide, 3 feet deep, 200 feet in the air for probably a quarter to a half a mile. So,
and I'm not sure that people with acrophobia picture that a canal boating experience would be something that they might need to think about that.
Well, that's the rare sort of.
Right.
But you're right. The locks and the bridges all add to the mystique. And for instance, on the Grand Union Canal, which is the one that we went on this time to Warwick, there's about 21 locks in a row in something what's called a flight. So it's up a hill or going down a hill. So 21 locks in a row does make for a vigorous exercise.
And when you say vigorous exercise, I don't think everyone understands why that would be exercise to go through a lock.
So the exciting thing, what I find about canal boats is there's no captain. You rent your canal boat from any number of companies that have small marinas scattered throughout England. They give you a lesson, probably takes about a half hour, on how to steer the boat, forward, reverse, and then how to work the locks, and they let you go. It is up to you to take the boat through the lock, and that involves someone pushing a huge oak door open. If you were going uphill, you would then drive the boat in. Someone would close the door behind you, and then someone would open one or two paddles in the far door. The water comes in, the boat comes up, and then you open that far gate and you travel out. But opening the paddles involves some vigorous exercise. This is an engineering system that's over 200 years old. While locks and paddles are replaced on a fairly frequent basis, they are large pieces of machinery. And
so you're turning a big gear or a big wheel, basically, that's getting the lock to open or close. And
Correct.
My understanding is when you do this with your family now, you're the captain. But when you first started this, you were doing this with your parents, and you were the crew. You were the one who was out there opening and closing the locks.
Yes, you are absolutely right. We went to England in the early 80s with my grandmother, and we were there for a short period of about 5 or 6 days on the canal, and my mother was concerned that 2 young teenagers would have enough to do. Well, that was not a problem. Now I'm significantly older, so I get to steer the boat, and everybody else opens the locks. But it's an amazing experience.
And you talked just a little bit about that they're used for walking, that the canals are. And, of course, that's because originally you were pulling the canals with mules. And so there's the towpath that you would tow your canal from. And you also mentioned seeing the canals in London. And if people haven't seen them, for instance, you can go up to the Regent's Canal in the northern part of London. It goes from Regent's Park over to, well, it goes further, but I've hiked it from Regent's Park over to the Camden Locks. Very pretty, very picturesque, and still a popular place for a walk and as well as a boat ride. And that's the first time I got a chance to really see these canal boats. And so when you talked about you rent a boat, you also called them narrow boats at one point when we were getting ready for this. They're, what, 60 feet long and 10 feet wide or something like that?
Oh, 10 feet would be generous. 7 feet wide.
Okay.
Actually, 6 feet 10 inches wide by 65 feet long. The locks are probably 10 feet wide. It's one boat in, and then if you're going uphill, someone comes in, you go out, then the person going in the opposite direction would come in and go the opposite direction. So you cannot fit 2 boats in there. And the boats in the original uses were filled with coal, and so they had to be very long and sturdy so they could carry as much coal or iron ore or whatever. And like you said, they were pulled by teams of horses, and there's actually a whole folk culture of people who lived on the locks, lived on the canals, and they have a specific style of art and how they decorated their boats. It was quite impressive.
And then within that, you have multiple cabins so that it works well, for instance, for a family to have the parents in one place and the kids in the other and some space in between at the other end of the boat.
Absolutely. You can do this with 2 people. You can do this with 12 people.
Okay.
The companies have boats that have bunk beds, and they have a kitchen, and they have bathrooms, and so it's all self-contained.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's quite common, and although it doesn't sound like you've done it, to rent bikes to ride along on the towpath as well if you have a larger group.
Absolutely. You could do that. If you live in England, a lot of people bring their dogs, and so the dogs will walk along the towpath with somebody, or dogs just sit on the deck and enjoy the sunshine. But bike riding is also very, very popular.
Excellent. Now, I'd like to get into a little more detail on the 3 different itineraries that you took, and kind of what the highlight was of each one and the sites that you were seeing. So, for instance, you started in Stratford, well known for one of its famous sons there.
He seems to have done well for himself.
Although I hear he didn't write any of that stuff. But
No, absolutely. It's all a Hollywood myth.
So the first cruise you did, and this is the cruise that you did as a teenager.
Yeah, we left from Stratford upon Avon. So really, that cruise was kind of, in the Navy, they would call it a shakedown cruise. So just kind of getting the idea of what we were doing.
So it wasn't that long.
No, it was about 5 days.
Okay.
And my grandmother, who was in her late 70s, early 80s, we kind of kept things fairly low key. But the enjoyable thing is the chance to interact with everyday people and the chance to stop at a pub, which is built along the side of the canal, have a real English pub meal outside in the beautiful sunshine. And you can walk around the small towns that are clustered along the canal. So really the highlights are just the trip itself.
Mm-hmm. So you start in Stratford, and Stratford gets some tourism, as it were, and then you headed to Warwick?
We headed towards Warwick.
Towards Warwick.
We didn't make it all the way to the Kingswood Junction, which is where Grand Union Canal meets the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal.
Okay.
Due to time constraints, we had to turn around on the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal and head back. So we just stayed on the Stratford-upon-Avon Canal.
And I'm assuming you can also do a one-way rental.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Our second trip was a one-way rental, yes.
Okay. And then the second trip was where?
Left from Llangollen, which is in the far north of England, and that went west to east to a small town called Marple. And that's where we went over the aqueduct, and we went through some very long tunnels, which are very dark. We did a good number of locks, and that was probably 6 or 7 days.
And it sounds like the topography between the two is quite different.
Yeah, I would say the topography around Stratford can be hilly, but the topography between Llangollen and Marple seemed to be a little hillier. Mm-hmm. And there are maps that you can see either online or you can buy in stores that will give you the exact amount of locks between point A and point B.
Sure.
And how long one usually would take on the average to get from point A to point B. So as people are planning their trips, it's very easy to see, okay, well, this trip I'd like to do a few more locks, so you do that trip. And then there are trips you say, I'm not really interested in doing quite as many locks, and so that you can choose that trip.
And in a 5-day trip, how far would you expect to be able to go on average?
Well, that's the interesting thing about canal boats. I could probably ride my bike in 3 hours and go as far as I would go in a week.
Right.
If I go in a week 25, maybe 30 miles, I'm doing pretty good.
So you really, at some point, you could get off and ride back into Stratford. I mean, you haven't gone that far.
We could easily have hitched a ride back to Stratford. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you pick a region where you want to enjoy that region if you're trying to pick one region over another.
Yeah,
okay.
Yes. And on the maps, they have different regions that a certain canal would focus on. Mm-hmm. And obviously, different regions of England have different things that they're famous for. And so if you want to see certain regions, then yeah, you can focus on specific areas.
And how long was your second trip?
That was about 7 or 8 days. I think that was the longest one.
Okay. And that was a one-way rental, you said?
Correct. That was a one-way rental, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed the one-way rental in the sense that we weren't going back through locks that we had been through already. Mm-hmm. And so everything was new. Every day was new.
I think of my daughter who, when she was little, we went on a hike that was in a circle around up in a mountain in British Columbia. We got back to where we started, and she said, well, we were here before. There was no point to that at all.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. But this was wonderful in the sense that you had the opportunity to see the industrial history of England, going through mill towns and mm-hmm. seeing where there had been warehouses that had been built next to the canal, which now have been converted to offices and houses. Everybody wants to live next to a canal now. So it's a very interesting sort of trip. And like I said, you had the aqueduct, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and you had lots of locks, and so it was quite fun.
Okay. And then the third trip?
The third trip, which was the one that we went on this July for my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, started just outside of Stratford, probably 5 or 6 miles in Wootton Waven.
Now, you didn't make your parents work the locks.
Oh, yeah. No, my mother and father, they both are out there giving it their all. They do an amazing job. And my sister and my wife and my niece were also. Everyone pitches in. That's what's so great about this, is that everybody has a chance to pitch in.
Mm-hmm.
So we left from Wootton Waven, which is about 5 or 6 miles outside of Stratford, up to Kingswood Junction, to Warwick, stopped in Warwick, which is a beautiful town. It has a beautiful castle, which is worth a trip by itself, and then walked around Warwick a little bit, and then we took the boat back to Stratford.
Okay. And if I were to go canal cruising in England, what's going to surprise me?
I think what will surprise you is just, we don't think of the English countryside when we think of England. We think of the Queen, we think of Buckingham Palace, we think of London, we think of soccer, but we don't think of the English countryside. And England in the 1700s and the 1800s was the Industrial Revolution. I mean, that's where it all began. And so I think you see what England was and how beautiful it is, and getting out there and just, like I said, turning off the cell phone and slowing down.
Okay. Best day you've had canal cruising?
Okay, the best day was going back through the Grand Union Canal from Warwick through the Hatton Flight, which is about 21 locks in a row. And it's always better if you go through a flight with somebody else. The locks tend to be wider in flights because they understood if you can get more boats through the flights, then you can move more goods. So in a normal lock, it's just very narrow, but in a flight, they tended to expand them. So we went through this flight, our boat and another boat. It was just a lot of fun because I got the opportunity to drive the boat. And the gentleman who was driving the other boat, he and his wife had been doing it for 30 years. Just to talk to him about their experiences, and they had an absolutely gorgeous boat, which they had done a lot of customization. It was really a piece of art.
Now, is that somebody who lives on the locks? Because I know that there are those who do.
There are some people who do, but by and large, what people will do is either rent or they'll have a timeshare, or some people will say, you live in London, you take the train out to the marina on Friday, you get in the boat, you go a couple days up and a couple days back, and there's your a long weekend.
Okay. And when you're done at the end of the day, you just tie up near town and walk into town to a pub for dinner? Or
you can do that.
Or cook on your own, I suppose.
Or you cook on your own. There's a stove and a refrigerator and a sink. You can just eat right there.
Okay. What's the best resource you found for getting into canal cruising?
The best resource I've found is a website called waterscape.com. That is, I guess, the official website of the British Waterways. There's the British Waterways website, which tends to be a much more official kind of nuts and bolts things. Waterscape is the kind of, here's what canal cruising is all about. Here are companies you can run from. Here is a little bit of the history. Here are ways that you can volunteer with the canals, that sort of thing.
Now, you're getting a chance to meet some of the locals. Who left the biggest impression on you of the locals you met doing this?
Well, the gentleman who, like I said, who had been doing it for 30 years, he and his wife, when we up the canal. But there was also a gentleman who I still am amazed. He was doing the canal by himself and his chocolate lab Fudge. And we tied up next to him, and we ended up talking to him. And he goes out literally every weekend, and his wife goes maybe once a month with him. But he literally goes every weekend on the canals, and he is able to operate the boat in such a manner that he can open and close locks and get the boat through all by himself, which is a feat of engineering in itself.
What's one place you wouldn't have seen from the motorway, or you wouldn't have seen if you hadn't been canal cruising?
The Kingswood Junction, which is where two canals come together, and there's a series of bridges and locks and beautiful traditional lock canal architecture, especially the lock keepers' cottages, which used to be where the lock keepers lived and their families, who used to open the locks for the people the boatsmen and the horses who went through. Mm-hmm. And they have a very distinctive architecture. They're barrel-shaped roofs, which I've never seen houses anywhere else barrel-shaped. And now the cottages are owned privately, and they're all very nice. They're beautiful. I can't even imagine just the excitement of owning one of them, because they're right on the canal, and people go by and you wave to them. And no, it's really quite beautiful. That Kingswood Junction area where you had a large area of water where two canals came together, and there was architecture, and there were the bridges and the locks. It was just really a beautiful sight.
Excellent. One warning you would give. Great vacation unless, or great vacation, but you should know.
It rains in England.
In England. I've heard that.
As we all know, it rains in England. So the first time we went on the canal boat, it was 80 degrees every day and clear blue sky. The second time we went on the canal boat, it was 65 degrees and rainy on and off. Last time, which was in July, mid-70s, dropping down to the mid-60s, drizzle, cleared up, drizzle. So it's kind of like the inverse of Hawaii, where it's warm and then it rains and then it's still warm. This is cold and rain and then it's still cold. But England, be prepared.
Okay. The first time that you were captaining the boat on your own, what was the one thing you wish they had told you in the orientation?
Don't run the boat aground.
Uh-oh.
Because the canals are very shallow.
Right.
So it's very easy to run the boat aground. And after a while, you get the hang of it. But
and when you say running aground, I'm picturing a canal with two definite lips, one on either side.
Well, the canal is deepest in the middle.
Okay.
And then it gets shallower on the side. And when you're steering a 65-foot arrow, and which is 10 feet wide, and you're trying to make sure you're in the middle of the canal, and then somebody's coming at you, and so you got to make sure you get to one side or the other, and you have to wave at the person, you wave at the people on the towpath. So it's a very social experience. Mm-hmm. So all those things trying to keep in mind. And then there's a lock coming up, and then there's a boat coming out of the lock, and so you're going too fast, and you turn the tiller in the wrong direction, and before you know it, you're stuck in the mud.
And how do you get off of the mud again? You don't call a wrecker, I assume.
No, you don't call the wrecker. You either put the boat in reverse and kind of work your way off, or they give you a pole that sits on the roof of the narrow boat, and you kind of pull your way off.
Okay.
Or, in worst comes to worst, someone pushes you off, who's on the canal path, kind of pushes you off using just brute force.
And how expensive is canal boating?
Well, it really depends. Obviously, the season that you go, summer being the high season, mm-hmm. the length of your trip, the size of your boat, it varies. But the nice thing about canal cruising is you can do it fairly inexpensively. You buy groceries at the grocery store, and you put them in your refrigerator, and you eat on board. You're self-contained.
Well, let's put it this way. If I think of a sort of a typical big ship cruise kind of experience, kind of the rule of thumb there is if you're paying $100 per person per night, above that is expensive, below that is less expensive. How does this compare to that?
Oh, cut it in half.
Okay.
Maybe even $30 per person per night.
Okay, excellent.
I mean, it's really quite inexpensive.
Right. But you don't get the bingo.
You don't get the bingo, and you don't get the all-you-can-eat buffet.
There you go. One thing that makes you laugh when you think about canal cruising in England?
Fudge.
The dog?
The chocolate lab, who ran alongside the canal boat. And just watching my niece enjoy herself, and my wife and my sister and my mother and my father, just watching them all enjoy themselves, and makes me smile and makes me laugh. Yeah.
Excellent. And before we get to my last two questions, do you have anything else that people should know before they go out and rent a canal boat and start cruising around the English countryside?
I can't really think of anything right now, but like you said, the Regent's Canal that goes through London, mm-hmm. there's an area called Little Venice there, which is a beautiful area. So you can kind of get an idea of what you're in for. Just FYI, if you are over 6 feet tall, you do need to duck your head.
Okay.
But no, it's an amazing experience and a chance for people to slow down and just reconnect and remember that we're all just kind of floating through life.
Excellent. Last two questions. Finish this sentence for me. You really know you're cruising on the canals in England when what?
When you're looking forward to the next lock.
Okay.
I wanted to see that next lock because that's another challenge. Or when that flight comes up, that's 21 locks in a row, that's exciting.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize the experience in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Slow down. Fun.
Excellent. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the Amateur Traveler and telling us about your canal cruising experience.
It's my pleasure. It's a wonderful experience, and hope others can experience it as well.
We had a comment on last week's episode, Trinidad and Tobago, from Traveling Ted, who said, first of all, thank you for linking the guest post done by Earth Explorer on my website. Secondly, thank you for getting me psyched up for my trip to Carnival in 2 weeks. As JD said, I found the perfect remedy for the post-holiday there is no snow in Chicago blues. Chrissy from Chrissy Travels commented on the episode on Bulgaria, Travel to Bulgaria, episode 312. Did you notice the use of the term super throughout Bulgaria? It became funny to me as I had heard the locals use it everywhere. Great country with a very forward and funky sense of fashion. But you are right, not much English at all. One of the hardest countries I've been in to navigate without knowing the local language. And this seems to be the week to hear from bloggers. Brock from Backpack with Brock commented also on the Travel to Bulgaria episode. Great collection. Sometimes it's hard to break free from typical tourist destinations, but this is a great example of how to do it well. Thanks so much for all of you for commenting. And with that, we're going to bring this episode of The Amateur Traveler to a close. If you also want to leave a comment, you can do so on the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. You can also send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. We also love 5-star reviews on iTunes. That helps people find the show. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
Got to see one more.